Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Council of the Americas for our headline event on ways to build the hemispheric trade agenda through USMCA expansion. My name is Eric Farnsworth, and I head our Washington office and also our trade promotion efforts. At the Council, we strongly believe that democracy, open markets, and the rule of law are essential for broad-based hemispheric growth and that they are mutually reinforcing. But as the Americas emerge from the recent pandemic, economies and job creation remain sluggish, voters are impatient, and democracies are stressed. Migration of those seeking better conditions has spiked, and the reform agenda has stalled. It's time for a new vision, one of increasing economic integration and trade that offers support for the broad-based, sustainable growth the region demands. It's time to take concrete steps to build and deepen supply chains for full global insertion. It's time to create a path for hemispheric nations to accede to the USMCA. Momentum continues to build for a robust US trade and investment initiative that will meet growing challenges while shifting the political narrative. As I just wrote in Barron's, the United States can help shape the future of the hemisphere through economic engagement and trade, boosting post-pandemic economic and social recovery while offering a critical transmission belt for democratic values. The US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA, was negotiated by President Trump and passed overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis by a Democratic majority Congress led by Nancy Pelosi. It strengthens North American supply chains while updating labor and environment provisions that have vexed previous agreements. Among other potential alternatives, establishing a path for democratic nations to the Americas to accede to the agreement would ignite regional discussions and create a competitive race to the top for those aspiring to closer links with the world's largest economy and most competitive region. The Western Hemisphere is in play, and US-led economic engagement helps build partnerships, link allies, draw job-creating direct investment in strategic sectors, and strengthen democratic governance. But we first have to engage more meaningfully with trade. And this is the reason why the Council of the Americas commissioned an issues brief, which we are releasing today and we will shortly be discussing, on possibilities and prospects for expanding USMCA. This is just the first step on a longer road, of course, but we can't afford to allow further time to pass before we start the conversation. You'll find the link to this brief on your screen in the chat, as well as links to the Barron's piece I mentioned and topical recent Senate testimony. Also linked are the biographies of our speakers today. In fact, we have a terrific lineup, including the author of our issues brief, Juan Baker, the Trade Minister of Costa Rica, Manuel Tovar, two sitting US Senators, Republican Bill Cassady and Democrat Michael Bennet, and private sector representative Jennifer Prescott of AWS, Amazon Web Services. Thanks to all of them and to all of you for joining us. We began our program today with Juan Baker, who is the author of our issues brief. He's joining us virtually from Mexico City. Juan Carlos, welcome back to the Council of the Americas. You were a top negotiator for Mexico of the original USMCA. There is no accession clause in USMCA. How is it possible to do what we're even trying to discuss this morning? Welcome to the Council.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you for having me. Thank you for this fantastic opportunity that you offered us to engage in this project and to advance on an agenda that we truly, deeply believed in, and that it could not be more timely. I also want to send my regards to everyone in the room. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you physically, but I promise that I'll be in Washington shortly, and we can continue with this conversation. And I think that what you're asking, Eric, is precisely the core of what we all are intending to do here. I would just add to your initial remarks the fact that the USMCA has proven to be a resounding success in these past 3 years. As you mentioned, I had the privilege and the honor to serve as Vice Minister of Mexico during that process. And I remember that at that point in time, there were plenty of questions and doubts around the success of the USMCA. How could the new disciplines be used in order to develop this platform that you were just mentioning? And the fact is that 3 years after, the USMCA has proven relevant to every account that we can possibly imagine. I will not dwell into the numbers, but it just suffices to say that Canada and Mexico are now the preferred partners of the United States, and so are the other two partners from Mexico and for Canada as well. Now, trying to take this one step above, as you are suggesting, I think that with the high levels of uncertainty and volatility that we see all around us, it makes a lot of sense from the North American perspective to seek this alignment of potential allies around the values and the objectives that we as North American countries already have. The fact that we all are trying to increase, complement, and reassert our own individual competitiveness and the regional competitiveness as well. Well, it only makes sense from that perspective that we try to project the spirit of the USMCA into the other countries that we consider friends and close allies. And the fact is that we are already doing that, even if it's in an advertently fashion, Eric, because when we looked at what the US has promoting in the body of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework or the Americas Partnership for Economic Prosperity, or even the individual efforts that the US has done, for example, with Costa Rica or other countries, we are already seeing that these objectives that lie at the core of our future competitiveness are already, in a way, an extension of the USMCA spirit. Now, having said that, and pointing to what you just described for us, a common argument that I have heard for questions that have been posed to me is that how could this be possible if the USMCA, as opposed to the old ancient NAFTA, does not have an accession clause? And while I recognize that it is true that there is no accession clause in the USMCA, that certainly does not hinder or prohibit countries from reaching agreements if they believe that those agreements are in the better spirit of the region. Now, there are already some provisions embedded in the USMCA that I would argue are not only relevant for this discussion, but also could be as a building block towards the objective of having countries joining the USMCA. The USMCA Free Trade Commission, we all know that the Free Trade Commission is the highest authority interpreting and implementing the agreement, has an article where its functions are spelled out. And among those functions, we can find that the Commission does have the authority to consider proposals to amend or modify the agreement. So arguably, if an amendment or a modification to incorporate language that would potentially enable countries to join the USMCA is proposed by any party to the consideration of the Commission already has the ability, as I'm saying, to consider that. Another possibility could be that the Commission establish particular working groups or a group of experts that looks at what are the guidelines or what are the necessary steps for countries to potentially join the agreement. And the discussions that such group of experts or task force will have may very much look like a sort of checklist of the things that the countries need to do in order to join, including potential domestic procedures that need to be fulfilled. And well, finally, although that this is probably much more general in sense, this article that I mentioned establishes that the Commission can take any other action that the parties might decide. And we know that the trade negotiations love to always keep that wiggling room available if needed. So in any case, I believe that it's not really a matter of making the economic case. I believe that is pretty much straightforward. I do not believe that it's a matter of making the strategic case. That already is happening beforehand, and we're witnessing all of that. It's not even a matter of technical expertise or legal places where these docking stations can be found, because those are already there. I believe that it's really a matter of political willingness, Eric, friends, of taking this step forward. I think that for that to happen, for that political injection of capital and efforts to be birthed into the process, there are two realities that we need to confront and reconcile. The first one is the fact that the three countries of North America are going to go through a general election process shortly. In Mexico and in the US, That is happening in 2024. We're going to elect the new head of the executive presidents, but also Congress, which for these matters is very relevant in the two countries. And Canada must go to a general election process no later than 2025. So with that reality, it's complicated. It's complicated to launch a process of this ambition in the next few months. But I would argue that we know when a perfect window is going to present itself, and that is in the 2026 review process. We all remember the review process of the USMCA was designed and incorporated into the agreement as a way of making sure that new ideas will always be considered forward, that the USMCA, as opposed to the NAFTA, was not going to be this monolithic, hard to move element or platform that we are aware now of the difficulties that it posed. So with this idea of keeping the USMCA evergreen, the review process might be used to, as I said, inject this political capital into the process of expanding the USMCA, given that all of these other questions are already answered. But at least the USMCA process could also be used, if not to complete a full accession of a member, at least to establish what are the next steps going to be in this regard. My ideal scenario would be that, prior to the 2026 review process, say on 2025, late 2024 or in 2025, the Commission explicitly task a mandate to this group of experts to come up with proposals on how this could be done. And then once that those proposals or those ideas are on the table, it will then be a good moment for the Commission to weigh in and start discussing what are those options and which one has probably more merit. And then start or set the process for having, aspirationally speaking, a country joining the USMCA in the period of time that the Commission deems necessary. Now, obviously, all of this is in the ideal world, and it has to be also reconciled, and I am just heading to my closing now. All of this has to be also reconciled with who those countries might be. I mean, because I just spoke at the beginning, as you did, Eric, on this process being a reflection of the North American values, a reflection of what we want to achieve in terms of competitiveness. And with that in mind, we also need to be mindful of which are the countries that we probably want to associate ourselves with. And there are some countries that naturally come to mind. And in the brief that you just described, there will be more details on that. But I think that it goes without saying, but just to make it super explicit, it must be countries that the current USMCA partners have free trade agreements with. It must be countries that have explicitly stated their desire to join our community. And it must be countries that have a proven track of fulfilling the trade commitments that they engaged on. And when we filter countries through those elements, there are just a few countries that could probably do the trick. And right now, with all of this in mind, I think that the most ripe country for trying this experiment would be Costa Rica. Others might come afterwards, but I think that Costa Rica, and Minister Tovar is there, so I don't really have to say much on this. But I think that all of this just boils down to my conclusion, which is also on the briefing, which just to closing up, the fact that there is no explicit accession clause on the agreement does not hinder or inhibits countries from considering other partners potentially joining. That has to be done very in conjunction or recognizing the political realities that we have. And that implies as well that the process, because of what I just described, is indeed going to be, or it should be considered as an aspirational goal. Countries that want to have a closer relationship with the North American region, they already know what we are up to, what we have been doing, and what is the most relevant and current instrument that explicitly reflects our values, and that is the USMCA. Thank you for having me. I'll stick around for questions.
Juan Carlos, thank you. You've opened our program brilliantly. I had about 3 or 4 follow-up questions, and you answered all of them. We'll leave it there, and we'll go to Minister Tovar. But as we are doing that, this is the report that Juan Carlos mentioned. And again, the link is on the website or on the chat here with the program. So we encourage you to take a look at it. It's a short and easy and quick read, despite the topic. So we call your attention to it. As we move to Minister Tovar, well, Costa Rica has already been mentioned favorably as perhaps a country that would be first in line, or certainly in the first tranche of countries to be considered for USMCA expansion. You yourselves, the president of Costa Rica, has sought this opportunity. Tell us why. What would it mean for Costa Rica to have access to the USMCA, Mr. Minister?
Thank you very much, Eric. Thank you very much to Juan Carlos and all my friends joining us here today. First of all, I would just like to start with one general comment in the sense that there is a need, an imperative need that the United States takes a closer look to the Western Hemisphere when we come to trade. The situation in the Latin American and Caribbean region has worsened over the years as we see the dramatic flows of migration, the organized crime as it is today showcases that there's a need to further strengthen ties with the region. Now, there are some interesting initiatives launched by the United States, like the APEC, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, in which we have engaged in a dialogue. We're still in a very early spirit. Hopefully, this will heat up as we go within the next weeks and months. However, yes, as President Chavez mentioned during Senator Christopher Dodd's visit to Costa Rica, we're not shy in saying that Costa Rica fits well in the USMCA. And why is that? First of all, we should recall that CAFTA has certainly provided us market access and allowed us to reform, to pass along over the reforms in certain disciplines like telecom and insurance. However, today we see it as a tight fit for us. We've evolved. Costa Rica has evolved. We have become an OECD economy, just like Canada, United States, and Mexico. That demanded us to pass very strict reforms in many public policy domains. Second, our economy is not the same one as when we negotiated CAFTA. We have developed a very strong and sound cluster in specific sectors of industry as medical devices, which today comprise about 40% of our exports and goods to the world. That showcases that we have upscaled ourselves in the global value chain, thanks to human talent, among many other things. And second, we have a flourishing semiconductor industry in Costa Rica. We have Intel, we have Corvo, and now, as you have well seen, the United States has partnered with Costa Rica under the Chips and Science Act to further develop our alliance in the semiconductor industry. So it is a different Costa Rica. It is a different region, different challenges. And of course, there has been an advancement of non-regional economies within the Western Hemisphere. So it is natural that a country like Costa Rica that likes to play and is committed and is ready to play with the highest standards, that has developed a very flourishing industry in sectors, economic sectors of interest to national security of the United States, but also to the industry of the United States, that we want to aspire. And we have taken this bold move to say, listen, why not? Look at us. Here's Costa Rica. Second of all, as I mentioned, our industry today is much more aligned to that of Mexico, to that of Canada, to that of the United States, since we negotiated CAFTA. Not only, as I mentioned, semiconductors and medical devices, but we see a lot of room to work together on aerospace, automotive industries, and that's something that we're working on to attract foreign direct investment in those sectors. So the possibility to accumulate origin with these economies, it's a very interesting opportunity for us. So I think that, Eric, we do have a case. We understand, as Juan Carlos mentioned, that there's electoral processes coming very soon in Washington, in Mexico, and later on in Canada. But this is a process that we have to continue, watering the seed when the time comes and politicians are ready. We're confident that the right decision will be taken. Now, trade has showcased that it improves not only lives and livelihoods, but it also creates economic growth. And that is where Latin America and the Caribbean today are in so much need. Costa Rica has reaffirmed, we have reaffirmed our way, our value proposition, our country proposition, and that's what we're betting on. That's what we're betting. We want to continue playing with the highest standards. And also, I think that it is a very good message that the United States and Costa Rica, we can send a strong message to those countries that are struggling in reforming themselves, that should they do the right thing, there's also a reward. So, this is not just things to be taken for granted. So that's the thing, that's the point. Costa Rica will continue being Costa Rica, we'll continue becoming even a better version of ourselves. And I think that there should be a room, of course, there should be a fertile ground to discuss trade. But I think that, and I expect that, this debate and under this initiative launched by Senator Cassady, Senator Bennet on America's Act, that is a very good platform to really discuss where should the United States go in terms of trade, where should the Latin American Caribbean region go in terms of trade. So we look very much confident, Eric, to continue contributing to this debate, to continue watering the seed. Hopefully one day we'll see a flourishing rose out there in the garden.
Mr. Minister, in about the 2 minutes we have before we bring Senator Cassady onto the screen, let me ask you the obvious follow-up question. You have access to U.S. CAFTA-DR trade agreement. You've already developed supply chains in a very meaningful way with cutting-edge industries, even without access to USMCA. How would access to more formalizing those supply chains with North America, do you need that? Do you need the headache that would bring to, in terms of negotiations and the scrutiny and all those issues? Why not just leave well enough alone?
Well, listen, as I mentioned before, our economy today is much more aligned to that of USMCA countries than CAFTA countries. In fact, the CAFTA agreement hasn't updated, hasn't been able even to host the institutional bodies meetings with more than 7 years without sitting between us and advance on a common agenda. So as I mentioned, the sectors, the type of economy that Costa Rica has become today, and the type of sectors that we're aiming at to develop as automotive and aerospace, that has a natural fit in the USMCA.
Yeah, and as a first mover, presumably investors would take a look at a country like Costa Rica before others.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us. What a terrific contribution you've made. And we have, I believe, Senator Cassady online. And Mr. Senator, we welcome you again to the Council of the Americas. What a joy to have you here with us again. You have been doing some amazing work to highlight the importance and the opportunities in the Western Hemisphere. Your America's Act is lively and relevant. And we want to give you the opportunity here in this conversation about trade and USMCA expansion. Tell us a little bit how you believe your act could benefit the trade agenda for the Western Hemisphere and perhaps help create that path forward toward USMCA expansion. Thank you again for joining us.
Again, thank you, Eric. Thank you all for being on. And many of you have helped collaborate, so I really appreciate it. Let me give a shout out to my assistant, Joel, who's really just done so much work on this. So we've got different pillars of what we're talking about. Let me start off with the one which I think has gotten the most comment. We would create a mechanism by which countries could, I like to say, bolt on to USMCA. And when it's renegotiated in 2026, reevaluated by the big three, if you will, those countries which could qualify based upon the rule of law, their environmental, the labor standards, et cetera, could bolt on. What are the advantages? Well, let me just give a few, and then we can imagine more. Right now, CAFTA is a hub and spokes. Here's the U.S. and it goes out to each of those countries. And the rule of origin applies to a product made within that country, but does not include those subsidiary products which may come in from another member of the CAFTA alliance or CAFTA treaty. So this would, instead of having the hub and spokes only from the US to that country, it would allow that kind of relationship between all members of USMCA. So if a Central American country took goods in from two neighbors, and in the aggregate, they had the domestic content requirement addressed, that would count. They could trade between themselves as if in USMCA, but as well as with Mexico and with the United States and with Canada. And so we think that this would facilitate trade in a way which has not yet been done. We also look at USMCA in terms of its positive effect on things like the environment. If you look at the carbon footprint of a unit of steel made in Canada, the US, and Mexico, it's all about the same. Contrast that with a unit of steel made in China or Russia, and it's 2.4 to 3.5 times more. These numbers are off the top of my head, but conceptually I'm right. So it also allows, if you will, a sharing of environmental values, and it doesn't disadvantage countries that decide to spend a little bit more to lower their pollution relative to countries which ignore international norms on pollution, but by so doing, they lower their cost of manufacturing and suck jobs away over there. That's one aspect of what we're proposing, Eric. There's other aspects as well. We try and come up with financing mechanisms that would encourage both the U.S. or another USMCA partner government financing, but with the purpose of spurring more foreign direct investment from private business. So we think that the foreign direct investment is more likely to give sustainable growth. And as countries in the Western Hemisphere look to nearshore or fringe shore, I would like to fringe shore within the Western Hemisphere. And that's, again, another aspect of this hemispheric trading zone. I could keep going, Eric, but let me stop and see what your thoughts are so far.
Oh, thank you very, very much. And I want to pick up on those comments because, you have been a strong voice in the Senate for taking a deeper appreciation for the Western Hemisphere from Washington. In fact, you've traveled several times to the region. You've spoken publicly about these issues when they're not very popular necessarily to do so. What do you think we're missing in Washington in terms of the Western Hemisphere? Let's take the aperture out just a little bit. What are the opportunities there? Why should we care so much when we've got Ukraine and we've got Taiwan and we've got, budget negotiations and all the other things? You've been a strong voice for Latin America. What's the passion there? Why are you doing that?
I was in lunch yesterday. This may seem tangential to you, but I'm going to tell you. I was in lunch yesterday looking for someone I had to have a conversation with. For me, he was the most important person for me to find. And I kept looking and I kept looking and I kept looking and I couldn't find the guy. And then finally, somebody spoke next to me and it was him. He was so close to me, I did not recognize the importance of the relationship. Now, we can go through a lot of things with Western Hemisphere. We can go through national security for the US, but also for other countries. We can go into shared values. Again, we just spoke of environmental and labor issues. But if those are not supported, then sometimes it goes to the lowest common denominator. So therefore, it's in our vested interest to support. We can look at, if we just talk about Mexico, I think I know that about 60% of the investment from the United States or the spend from the United States and Mexico returns to the US. We're only about 10 to 15% of the spend that the US spends in China returns to the US. So just looking at it from a strictly US viewpoint, we get more return on our foreign expenditure if we invest it with our neighbors than if we invest it overseas. I anticipate these increased ties would make that. By the way, since the renegotiation of USMCA, Mexico has become the US #1 trading partner. So now there's other factors there, I'm not denying that. But still, the fact is, we know that this is a powerful mechanism to take advantage of shifting trade. And as we do so, and as Mexico becomes more prosperous, it benefits the US. And as the US prosperity goes, so that benefits Mexico and Canada. So that is the beauty of capitalism. Everybody wins, and that's what I'm trying to do. Everybody a winner.
Yeah, and as we've come out of the pandemic, and we're talking about supply chains moving perhaps from Asia or other places into the Western Hemisphere, some of that has happened, perhaps not as much as some of us were hoping that it would, but presumably your legislation would help encourage some of that, no? And just to the point you're making, people will invest when they're secure environments and where they have opportunities, et cetera. You mentioned Mexico. I'm extrapolating from there and assuming that that's also helping to animate what you're trying to do through the Americas Act.
Well, you mentioned earlier Taiwan and China.
Yeah.
Now, Costa Rica understands now making computer chips. Isn't that great? If China invades Taiwan and between the two countries, those computer chips go offline for the US, I think I'm told it's about 40% of our supply. Wouldn't it be nice to have kind of a geographically diversified supply, including one with a more secure relationship? A very high percentage, I'm a doctor, so this comes to mind, a very high percentage of our nation's pharmaceuticals, including penicillins and cephalosporins, are made in China. Now, we hope not, we pray not, we work not, but if there were to be conflict with China, that would be a problem for everybody if the global supply of those antibiotics goes offline. Wouldn't it be more secure for all if we had more of a diversified geographic supply chain? Now, in some places, it's going to be profitable to do that in the US, some in Mexico, but in other places, another country. And for other countries, among those countries I want included would be those from Latin America or the Caribbean. I'll mention one more thing. By the way, I was met with the Peruvian ambassador yesterday. He said, one, they're looking to do more value-added diversification of their economy into more value-add. That's perfect with the Americas Act. They're seeking to ascend in the OECD. Isn't that positive? And they have bilateral treaties with Mexico, the United States, and Canada. I mean, it's just like, this is kind of the place you could go and imagine a bolt-on to USMCA. And I think Peru would benefit and the US would benefit.
And they have terrific cuisine to boot, so we would have even that reason. I'm being facetious here, of course, but
You're not being facetious.
well, not about the cuisine, but no, indeed. And Peru, of course, is hosting the APEC meeting next year as well in 2024. We've got it in San Francisco this November, but next year it will be in Lima once again. So another reason perhaps to look south even further. So I see that we have Senator Bennet online, and I want to bring him into this conversation with you, Senator Cassady, in part to show the importance and the relevance of bipartisanship in this effort. And I really want to congratulate both of you and compliment both of you for the partnership and working together. It's so important. Senator Bennet, welcome to the council. And I just wonder if you could give us a word about, from your perspective, Congress doesn't seem to work so well together these days all the time, but in this effort, we've got a fully bipartisan effort. Why is that? How important is that?
Well, it's incredibly important, and I want to before we lose him, I want to thank Bill Cassady for his leadership on this. I mean, he really was stepped out, I think, to lead, and I kind of put my hand up to say, I want to join you in this effort because I think it's so important to the future of our country, the future of our region, and actually even the future of my state of Colorado. And he was very willing to have me be part of that. You're right. I mean, in Washington, there's some people who think they're here just to do their work by themselves. That's a whole other problem. But then there's a lack of bipartisanship is a critical part of the same puzzle that improves trade and people-to-people efforts and our relationships in this hemisphere. Those that are listening across the hemisphere are aware that by virtue of our intertwined cultures and history and proximity, we're often affected by the same forces. And so in the Americas Act, we take different elements such as trade and investment and people-to-people exchanges that I mentioned, create a comprehensive and resilient mechanism of integration and cohesion that will enable our hemisphere to thrive together. And that's not a democratic idea. It's not a Republican idea. In fact, it won't ever be a durable idea. It won't last if it's not done in a bipartisan way here and in the equivalent fashion in other countries. So I'm very, very pleased to have the chance to work on this with Senator Cassady and others who are approaching us in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, because across the American political spectrum, there's an understanding that we can't go another 50 years, and look back on what might have been. So quite simply, we need the votes to get something like this across the finish line. We're going to need bipartisan votes to do it. We could build off of successful efforts, as Bill was saying, like the USMCA, which passed the Senate with nearly 90% of the votes there, reflecting the broad support it has here, just like the broad support it had in Canada and Mexico when it passed in those places as well. And I would say even more recently, I've been proud to work in a bipartisan manner again, and really since the first time that Ronald Reagan was our president, to pass a bill and at a time when we were shipping basically everything to Southeast Asia and to China, we finally have passed a bill to bring an industry back to the United States, the semiconductor industry. That has broad bipartisan support as well, and it's broadly supported in the country. And there's still a lot more work to do, even for the semiconductor supply chain. And through the collaboration with Western Hemisphere allies, I think we can create even more jobs and economic opportunities throughout the hemisphere by strengthening our mutual supply chains, creating new jobs, growing international trade and opportunity. And really important to me, and I think to Republicans and Democrats in the United States, countering China's growing influence over global manufacturing and geopolitics by uniting democracies in our hemispheres. These are bipartisan foreign policy goals, and I think the United States has to show up. And I'm really glad to continue this work with Senator Cassady and our partners across the region, so we don't go another half century without a long-lasting plan to benefit, as I said, the next generation. So right now, I'm very hopeful, looking forward to the future with the Americas Act and the vast opportunity we all have to build a prosperous, safe, and free hemisphere. That's a pretty easy thing to sign up to.
Senator Bennet, Senator Cassady is going to have to leave in just a few minutes, but before he does depart, I wanted to follow up with what you just said, because you've noted in the past the need to update some of our trade agreements and to bring them more into the modern age, add things like digital and some of the provisions that haven't been incorporated or weren't incorporated into previous generations, et cetera. But there's also a basic fairness question, isn't there? I mean, when a country like Costa Rica is treated exactly in the same way for trade purposes as a country like Nicaragua, we seem to have a problem, don't we? Isn't there a way to begin to change that dynamic? And how does the Americas Act seek to do that?
Is that for me or for Bill?
That's for you, if you're willing.
Oh, great. I think that, I guess I know that there are existing trade relationships in the region. But if you look at the past 50 years, you're going to find that these arrangements were developed to address the concerns of their time. And I think that doesn't always consider a lot of the major challenges that our hemisphere is currently facing. And the truth of it also is that those agreements were made at a time when, when a lot of our foreign policy was shaped by the Cold War. So I think we have a chance here to update the agreements to make sure that we're not treating Costa Rica and Nicaragua the same, which makes no sense at all. To incorporate new challenges that we're facing around mass migration and climate change and artificial intelligence and the growing Chinese and Russian influences that I mentioned, and I think we're the momentum is in our direction anyway. As you guys, I think Bill mentioned, just as of this year, Mexico became the U.S. The top trading partner of the United States, is surpassing China. That's critically important, to advance our economic priorities in Mexico's, to understand that and to further strengthen relationships throughout the region. So I think we have a real opportunity as we take these lessons and we work with partners in the region to improve our labor, environmental, and other standards, our commitment to transparency, our commitment to the rule of law, our commitment to diminishing corruption. I think there's a really important way for us to fill the void. And we also need to look at strong examples that exist, like what Intel is doing in Costa Rica, and commit ourselves to growing our economies together. So I think, we could certainly take the time to go country by country and piece by piece to replace trade agreements, but I don't think that's going to accomplish the goals that the U.S. should have or that our partners in the region want. And the reality is that the United States is in a position to have a more integrated and comprehensive approach that reflects the shared values and cultures and history that this hemisphere has. And I think our current partners, I hope, share that view. And I believe there's a plenty of opportunity for future partners who want to strengthen their own democracies and their own commitment to the rule of law with a better global or international relationship in the hemisphere.
Eric, can I jump in for a second?
Yeah, please.
First, let me thank Michael. Nothing happens in this town unless you get 60 votes. And we were shopping around, and Michael and his staff did a deep dive, and they came back and they said, we're in. And my team and I just all high-fived. And that has changed things. Chris Dodd has become the biggest cheerleader of this proposal. And obviously, Chris is President Biden's emissary to Latin America. And he's the cheerleader, not just because of the content, but because Michael came on board. Now, and I was on Chris, he's in Peru or Chile. He called me last night and we were talking via WhatsApp. So I just say that because, as Michael said, it doesn't happen if it's not bipartisan. And Michael, they are all in, and they've made the product better. Secondly, just regarding Nicaragua and Costa Rica, now, what some people consider a flaw in USMCA, which is the absence of an investor dispute resolution process, with some exceptions. But nonetheless, when you talk to Lighthizer, he says that if somebody wants to invest in a dangerous country where their investment might be nationalized, they should go in with eyes wide open, and it shouldn't have the implicit subsidy or the implicit backstop of an investor dispute resolution process. Who would invest in Nicaragua? Like nobody. I mean, Nicaraguans aren't investing in Nicaragua. Ortega is doing such a miserable job of, the only thing Ortega is doing a great job of is ruining democracy and ruining his country. But it also points out one thing that USMCA does, to the degree that one thing that the Americas Act does, to the degree that it promotes stability in government, it makes an economy more stable, and it makes people less likely to leave their home to migrate to the United States in a regular fashion. And so I actually think what some people think is a flaw of USMCA addresses the difference between Costa Rica and Nicaragua, and the degree to which Costa Rica is doing fantastic, we all know that, but the degree that a country does better because of this trade relationship and has a better future also makes it less likely to have instability leading to irregular immigration. I got to sign off. Michael, thanks for being on, man.
Thanks, Bill. Thank you. Look forward to seeing you soon.
Senator, thank you very much for both of you being here. And yes, indeed, Senator Cassady had a hard stop. And Senator Bennet, I understand you have to run as well, but I do want to say thank you again.
Thank you. I just want to thank everybody for their efforts. And I really do think, our political systems, all of us know this, ebbs and flows. And you can detect moments when the tide is turning against these kind of mutual relationships, at a time when there's momentum building. And we're at a moment, I think, really at the first time in maybe 50 years when there's massive momentum building in the Western Hemisphere to create a more integrated economy that I think will serve all of our people well. And so I just encourage everyone to put your shoulder to the wheel. There's a lot of good work we can get done here. And Eric, thank you for leading on this effort.
No, it's a real pleasure, and it's a passion. Speaking of passion, if Coach Prime played Bill's LSU Tigers, who would win?
Coach Prime would always win.
Bill is near to defend him, but you're right.
All right, you guys, take care. Thanks. Bye.
We'll come back here to the Council of the Americas, where we still have the private sector voice that we want to bring into the conversation. Jennifer Prescott is with AWS. She's been extraordinarily patient in awaiting her turn. But Jennifer, you've done some monumental work on some of these issues, and it's not fair to ask you to speak on behalf of the private sector, but nonetheless, we'll do that. Why do these issues matter to the private sector? We just heard about investment. We just heard about, taking risk and all these issues. How are you looking at these issues? And is it something that USMCA accession makes sense?
Well, thanks so much, Eric, for inviting me today to be part of this really important conversation. And it's great to be here with you and old friends like Juan Carlos. Great to see you. And of course, Minister Tovar. We're really happy to be part of it. And I think, these really high standard free trade agreements like USMCA are so important to a company like Amazon and to our customers across the hemisphere, because they just raise the bar. They raise the bar in terms of promoting the digital economy, cutting red tape, facilitating, customs, and also raising the bar, as the senators were saying, on labor and environment commitments. And these are just super important things to our company and to many U.S. companies across the board. And I think also, I think the minister really, put his finger on the importance of economies across the hemisphere really evolving over the last few years, right? And so when we talk about like the innovative digital commitments of USMCA, why is that important? Because the digital economy is now the vast majority of the economy, not just in the US, but in Costa Rica and in Mexico and in lots of these economies across the hemisphere. So, and that's everything from the micro and small and medium-sized businesses, right, to multinationals, and it cuts across every sector, including some that were already mentioned this morning: semiconductors, pharmaceuticals, agriculture, right? They're all part of the digital economy now. And so these kinds of updated provisions are super important. And I mean, just to give a couple of examples, I think, the cybersecurity provisions in the digital chapter of USMCA, super important, including to countries like Costa Rica that have suffered some really significant cyber attacks. And those provisions are really aimed at helping countries to improve their capabilities to respond to those kinds of cyber attacks and to build collaboration and information sharing in that space among the parties. And so super important, but the benefits aren't limited to the digital chapter. The trade facilitation, the customs procedures, and the senator kind of noted this, going beyond the hub and spokes, to really expanding, the importance of the customs facilitation across the hemisphere. Really important provisions like de minimis that are lowering the burden on customs officials and really helping, again, small and medium-sized businesses in particular to benefit from the digital economy. There was also a great study by Third Way recently, really identifying that these kinds of customs facilitation provisions really help small and medium-sized businesses. They grow jobs and economic growth. And so these are the kinds of provisions that could be expanded and essentially an instantaneous update, if you will, to older free trade agreements that just don't include those kinds of provisions like CAFTA-DR or even the Peru FTA that the senator was mentioning. So I mean, that's why these are really important to our company, and I think lots and lots of other companies. And we hear lots of people talking about nearshoring and friendshoring. We heard it this morning, and it's a great concept, and it's promoting more secure supply chains, which are also important to Amazon and other companies. But the actual way that you do that is free trade agreements. It's those customs facilitation and market access provisions that actually are the provisions that make those supply chains connect. and bring that nearshoring and that investment, into the countries that are participating in those high standard agreements. And so looking to like-minded allies like Costa Rica and to others in the hemisphere to join or to bolt on, as the senator was saying, the highest standard agreement that the United States and Mexico and Canada have, that is just a no-brainer in terms of really implementing that concept of friendshoring and nearshoring.
These points that you're making are so critical, because if you look at the trade agreements that the United States has with the Western Hemisphere, the last one was 2011. That's over 10 years ago. Think about the state of the economy in 2011, right? I mean, we're still using, I don't even know if the company still exists anymore, BlackBerries.
I loved my BlackBerry.
Well, so did I. I took it out of my hand, kicking and screaming. But having said that, but the world has fundamentally changed, and it's not just for tech companies; it's for every company, because every company uses tech. No.
Yep. Exactly.
And so the question then is, from the perspective of the private sector, is something like USMCA accession, is that the best way to move forward, or would it be easier, more simplistic, less politically complicated, et cetera, just to try to update some agreements that we already have? I mean, that's a question I get asked a lot. Well, you've already got CAF to DR, for example, with Costa Rica. Why don't you just update it? Mm-hmm. How does the USMCA provisions that you've just talked about, how do they supersede and excel beyond that other potential strategy?
Well, it's a great question, and having like Juan Carlos spent some of my career negotiating some of these agreements. Yep. I can tell you that there's a lot of effort that goes into that across all the governments that participate, and updating each one is really not nearly as efficient as having an agreement like USMCA that already sets an extremely high bar across all of these issues, from digital to labor to environment, that, as you said, passed by overwhelming bipartisan support. You had that partnership between Ambassador Lighthizer and Speaker Pelosi at the time that basically agreed, like, this is a gold standard agreement and we're going to move it forward. And so you already have that congressional buy-in that this is the right, bar. And you have a lot of support from the business community, right, for USMCA. You have interest by like-minded allies to sign up to that. And so if you already have that bar and you have a lot of buy-in for it already, getting countries to sign up to those commitments, and really then just the job of the negotiators then is to figure out the accession protocols, what that looks like. That's actually a more efficient way to go about getting that high standard outcome more quickly. And you may not even need trade promotion authority.
Right. Well, and I think that's critically important, because everything in Washington at the end of the day comes down to process. And do you have the political support to drive the process to its conclusion? And if you don't have to deal with some of the process, you're already that much further ahead. Yeah. These are terrific comments. Again, I gave you an unfair assignment to speak on behalf of the private sector, but I think you did it. I think you did it admirably. We have just about 5 minutes to go, and we still have 3 experts here who've already spoken, but I want to give each of them, Juan Carlos Baker and Manuel Tovar and Jennifer Prescott, the opportunity in 2 minutes or less, because we will cut your mics off, to offer any final comments that might have come up based on the conversation, or a key point that you just think needs to be re-emphasized. Juan Carlos, we'll go to you. I would ask that you keep your comments to 2 minutes or less.
Well, there's very little that I can add, Eric, other than I'm encouraged by what I'm listening to. I believe that this idea, it's worth pursuing, and I just hope that we have the maturity, and we have also the strategic view to have it implemented. And it's something that it will certainly be driven by the countries, the 3 governments of the current USMCA members. But as we can see, there's a lot of stake, and we believe that, and I believe that we all should do what we can to promote this agenda, and count me in.
Fantastic. Thank you. And you met your assignment with flying colors. So we'll see if Minister Tovar can do the same. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Eric, and I'm very happy to have had the chance to join such an honor prestigious panel here today. Listen, one reflection: when we first sought OECD membership, this was called by some as a quixotic and crazy, endeavor, but we proved everyone wrong. So we truly believe that our bold move to request membership to the USMCA when the time comes goes precisely in the same spirit as we sought membership to the OECD, to become a better version of ourselves, to improve, and also to create better opportunities to our counterparts as well. This is not just for Costa Rica, but we truly believe that Costa Rica's membership accession to USMCA really benefits our partners. More than 50% of our trade is conducted with USMCA partners. $82 coming into FDI in Costa Rica came from the United States. So we have a very strong
82% of every dollar.
82% of every dollar. 82% of FDI coming to Costa Rica from the United States.
Yeah.
So there is a evident linkage between our economy and those of USMCA partners. So we're very happy that there's this growing debate in Washington and on trade, because trade really matters. Trade matters not only for the national security interests of the United States, but it is important to the economic interests of the United States. As I mentioned, the region today is very much different of that when we negotiated CAFTA. The challenges that we face in the region are different and more dramatic than the ones that we face when CAFTA. And we truly and honestly think that Costa Rica needs another jacket that suits us better than CAFTA. Lawyers should find a way to figure out how to advance in enlarging the process when the time comes. But I think that we will continue preaching to the choir and explaining why do we think that USMCA should open up for the benefit of the USMCA partners, but also to the benefit of the region. And I think that Costa Rica will continue playing its role in leading this debate. And we're confident that at some point, as I mentioned, the rose will flourish in the garden.
Fantastic. Well done. Well, very impressive wrap-up comments, but we're going to give the last word to Jennifer Prescott. So Jennifer, to you, you've heard what everybody has said. You concur, I assume, but maybe you don't. What's your final comment?
No, strong agreement across the board. And thanks again for inviting me and for organizing this. Again, it's a really important conversation. And I think, again, these high standard trade agreements that reflect the current economy, the digital economy, and the importance not just of tariffs being lowered, but those customs facilitation kinds of provisions, super important to a company like Amazon, to our customers, but to many across the business community, in terms of really being able to implement this nearshoring, friendshoring concept. And having just traveled throughout the region, I can say that hearing this interest in Costa Rica, we hear it in so many countries that they're really interested and committed to signing up to these high standard commitments, to having more hemispheric trade, to having that facilitated, to more partnerships, more collaboration across these super important issues like cybersecurity, like the development of responsible artificial intelligence, right? Like all of these kinds of conversations and economic flows are facilitated by high standard trade agreements. So thinking about how you take the highest standard one and the most recent, like USMCA, and just expanding those benefits to more countries across the region, again, is just something that makes a tremendous amount of sense. And I hope that more of our governments start talking about it and count on us, and I'm sure others in the private sector to be cheerleaders.
Well, thank you very, very much. And what a privilege it's been to host this conversation with some real experts, talking about the possibility of the expansion of USMCA to countries in the Western Hemisphere. You know, we weren't able to answer all the questions today. We weren't trying to answer all the questions. This is the beginning of a conversation, and we encourage all of you to join us here at the Council as we continue to lead the effort in terms of expanding the trade agenda into the Western Hemisphere and making it more robust for the people of the region and the benefit of the majority across Latin America, the Caribbean, and North America. Before we close, I did want to give a very special shout out and thank you to the folks literally behind the camera who make this program work. None of us were hired to be television producers, and yet after the pandemic, we've all become that. And it takes a full team effort, not just here in Washington, where my team has done a spectacular job, but also at our headquarters in New York, and also among our colleagues in Miami. This is a full team effort across the Council of the Americas, and I just want to say thank you, because without your help, this is literally not a possibility to bring this type of content to the wider audiences. So thank you to them. Thank you to the participants and our speakers this morning. We encourage all of you again to continue to work with us here at the Council of the Americas. With that, my name is Eric Farnsworth. I love having the opportunity to do these things. I hope it shows, and we will talk to you very, very soon. Have a terrific rest of your day.